This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
And also by Enterprise in Space, an international programme of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. My name is Clara Cook, and joining me today is my fellow co-host, Duncan Barrett. Hello, Duncan. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Clara?
I'm good. Have you been trapped for 7 years somewhere?
Not recently. I mean, it's as we're recording, we're in the kind of final stretch leading up to the Christmas holiday. So I don't know about you, it sort of feels slightly like I've been trapped by work for an eternity, but I suppose it's just a year. Nothing.
It's not 10 years. 10 years of travelling around.
Nothing compared to 10 years or 7 years in the case of some travellers we might talk about. But yeah, I can kind of empathise with the desire to, set free and go and do something else.
So in case you hadn't realised what we're talking about today, we're talking about the Short Treks episode, Calypso. So it's one of the first few Star Trek short films in the history of the Star Trek franchise. And the reason why we're talking about it is because it's linked very closely to several different cultural stories, I guess you could say. Obviously, the one that's most similar to is Homer's Odyssey. That was the main inspiration for the story. But well, also, there's
not Betty Boop.
Not Betty Boop. Thank God, man. Thank God. But
you see, I'd prepared for like an hour-long discussion on Betty Boop. I'm not going to have much to say about the Odyssey, I don't think.
That's okay. I've got Odyssey on the brain. So.
Okay, fair enough. Well, you're a classicist, Clara, so this is kind of home territory for you, right?
I was very excited when I found out that they were going to do a Star Trek, even if it's a short episode, even if it's only 15 minutes, a Star Trek episode that was kind of closely connected to Homeric myth and Homeric epic, which was exciting. Well, also there's other cultural influences such as Funny Face and like you said, Betty Boop.
Absolutely. The three pillars of, modern literary culture there. It's an interesting Western combination.
Society.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's funny that you said, you were looking forward to it knowing that it was based on the Odyssey. I was going to ask you, because I went into it knowing it was called Calypso, I knew it had been written by Michael Chabon, who obviously is this, very lauded modern writer, Pulitzer-Prize-winning writer. So I was kind of intrigued to see what he would be writing about. It actually didn't occur to me, and it wasn't until the end of the episode that I suddenly kind of realised that that's what I've been watching. I don't know why I didn't make the connection all the way through. I think because going into it, I was thinking Calypso. I was thinking like Calypso music. I was thinking, are we going to get, is this going to be kind of Mambo Picard part 2? What's going to be going on in this story? And so I watched this episode. I thought, this is kind of weird. This sort of, this feels vaguely familiar, this story. And then I got to the end and I was like, oh, right, Calypso. Yeah, that kind of makes sense now. But it's interesting. So you went into it kind of knowing that was what it was going to be based on, in a sense, that was the kind of cultural touchstone, rather than me going in being slightly bamboozled by it and then realising at the end.
Well, it's only because I read some spoilers online, to be honest.
You see.
Yeah, I read some reviews from people in America who have seen it before I did.
Well, it's because it always takes us a few days, right, to get these short treks. And even then we're watching them back to front and upside down and, with the sound all distorted and so, or Officially, we're not watching them at all, of course, but if we do manage to see them,
we should be careful what we say.
Yeah, and obviously we're reviewing this episode, which clearly we haven't seen, purely based on our sort of imagining of what it might be like. But yeah, we definitely get them in an unusual form, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Originally, I thought that it was going to be something tropical. I don't know why. I actually thought it might be something, I don't know, I had in my mind like a tropical kind of fruity cocktail.
Right.
Calypso, Calypso music. And actually, when I first watched it, I thought of Circe rather than Calypso.
Right.
But then I was like, oh, no, wait, hang on a second. There was another woman that trapped Odysseus. Because as, if anyone's read the poem, you'll know that he basically slept his way around the Greek islands. Which Kraft doesn't do.
Not entirely by choice in this instance. I mean, Homer goes to great lengths to describe how he's an unwilling lover for Calypso, doesn't he?
I know,
and,
it's a hardship.
Every night he goes and shares her bed. This unwilling lover. But at the same time, yeah, you're right. It happens to him a few times in the story, and I think you're right. Like Calypso and Circe, I don't know about you because you're more familiar with this story than I am, but I get them mixed up quite easily. I think they're quite similar, and they're described in the same way, right? They're both, there's the same description. The version of the Odyssey that I've been reading this week in preparation is the audiobook recorded by Ian McKellen, which I think is based on the Robert Fagles, is that his name, the translator?
Yeah.
And the translation there is the nymph with the lovely braids, or as Ian McKellen says, the nymph with the lovely braids. So it's this kind of lovely expression that you kind of get over and over again, and is applied equally to both of those characters, confusingly.
Yeah, well, part of this is one of the reasons why they have sort of similar descriptions, especially for they have it for male characters too, but especially for female characters. They always refer to Athena as the goddess with the cow eyes, which means like big, beautiful brown eyes, or the god, like Aphrodite's the goddess of the white arms. Is because I think those were parts in the poem where they were like markers. They would help people remember. Because remember, all this is an oral tradition. So Homer's actually, I probably should explain a little bit about what the Odyssey is for our audience who doesn't remember or know or learn about the Odyssey. The Odyssey
can you just tell me, is there a goddess in the Odyssey who's described as having a funny face, though?
A funny face.
You see, because that would be a convenient one. Right?
No, but there is a goddess of wisdom, and I suppose the character in the funny face, is supposed to be very intelligent and wise. I mean, Athena's the goddess of wisdom, and she's the patron goddess of Odysseus. So, yeah, we can go on to talk about Funny Face. I thought Funny Face was an odd choice. I'm not quite sure why they chose that musical over other musicals, or that love story over other love stories, because I wouldn't say Funny Face is the most romantic of films. That I feel a little bit like Zora was shortchanged there.
It's not. It's not really the Odyssey is to classical literature. It's not that to Hollywood musicals necessarily.
No,
Funny Face.
No,
it's more of a kind of a slightly curious choice, I think.
Yeah. But a little bit about the Odyssey. So the Odyssey is a poem, an epic poem from the 8th century BC. It was attributed to the poet and the bard Homer. Obviously, we don't have clear records about who actually wrote this poem, so we attribute it to Homer, but it's likely that Homer was several people, partly because there were no real written records at this time. It comes from an oral tradition, so it's a poem that would have been read, well, more likely would have been sung by a bard who was playing a lute or like a stringed instrument like a harp. And the whole idea is that at the beginning of the Odyssey, like the Iliad as well, you would invoke the goddess, the muse of poetry, and she would speak through you the stories of the heroic myths of ancient Greece and the stories of the gods. And it's all about Odysseus, who is this wily, crafty hero, heroic ancient Greek hero, who has finished fighting in the war on Troy. So the Greeks and the Trojans had a big war over Helen of Troy, which I'm sure you guys will all remember is the face that launched 1,000 ships. She was the most beautiful woman in the world. And after sacking Troy and taking slaves and killing loads of people, the Greeks left to take their spoils of war back home. And Odysseus, on his way back to his island, which was called Ithaca, which still exists today, there is still an Ithaca, you can go visit it. He had loads of adventures trying to get home. So he had 10 years of being at war. And then he had 10 years in which he struggle to get home back to his wife and son. So it is a little bit like Kraft, the character in Calypso. Kraft is involved in some mythical war that he can't really even remember why he's fighting. It's been 10 years of fighting, and he's trying to get home to his wife and son. And it's that idea that when Odysseus left, and when Kraft left their homes, their sons were babies. And so when they return, their sons are going to be adult men. So it's that kind of horrible, epic journey where a hero has big adventures, but has this unbearable longing and homesickness, like just desperate to get back to his family, but keeps getting stuck in various places.
And that sense of longing, actually, funnily enough, is where we sort of meet Odysseus at the beginning of the Odyssey, isn't it? Because the structure of the story is slightly kind of flipped on its head. So although the time that Odysseus spends with Calypso is actually kind of towards the end of the story, or at least towards the end of the kind of wild adventuring part of the story, because there's another whole chunk about when he gets home and what he finds there. We're actually kind of given almost a sort of preview of it at the start of the story. So it's like when we first meet Odysseus, it's in this situation, and he is very much longing to go home. I mean, he is kind of this prisoner. He spends his nights in bed with this lovely nymph, he spends his days weeping on his own, kind of longing to go home, and very lonely, and very much a prisoner, much more than Kraft is in the Star Trek story. But it's interesting, you were talking about these kind of adjectives, these kind of stock epithets, right? I think is how they're referred to, that are applied to different characters, and how that kind of feeds into the oral tradition, and whether that's to do with making the sort of oral poetry easier to remember, because you have these kind of familiar phrases repeated over and over again. But the epithets that are applied to Odysseus, one of the ones that I know is often applied to him is this word polymetis. Is that how it's pronounced? Which I think means something sort of along the lines of crafty or cunning or wily. So again, there's that kind of link. In the Star Trek episode, we've got this character who it's all about, what's your name and what does the name mean? And is your name, who gives you your name? What does it represent about yourself? And there's this character who's saying his name is Kraft. Well, Kraft, very close to the idea of being crafty, and both the characters, I suppose, there's this sense of, are they telling the truth about each other? Is there a kind of, are they being totally honest with each other? And again in the Short Treks episode, one of them calls the other one a liar. So it's this kind of running refrain of, one of them says something, the other one says liar, and it becomes quite poignant towards the end, the kind of meaning that there is in that, because I think the last time it's used, it's Zora saying to Kraft, look, it doesn't matter, it doesn't count that you've had this kind of connection with me. I'm not a real person. You're not really sort of emotionally cheating on your wife or whatever. And he calls her a liar at that point. And I was amazed when I went and looked up the meaning of the word Calypso. The meaning of the word Calypso is actually from a word that means to hide or to deceive. So the name Calypso literally is essentially liar. So this name that they've been throwing around, calling each other throughout this episode, where, as well as everything else that's going on, there's this kind of question of, what is his name? Who gets to give him his name? What does it say about him? In the kind of original source and in the title of the episode is this idea of a character who is named as being a liar.
I think where the story differs in the Star Trek short trek compared to the actual epic poem is that Zora has the chance to keep Kraft with her, but she makes a moral decision, and that's quite important. She's essentially an artificial being, but she's making very moral human decisions, and almost her strange faith that the crew will return, even though it's been 1,000 years and the crew won't return. Like, the crew are long dead. She still stays there. It's like she has this belief. I mean, there's this idea that maybe she would actually at some point decide to leave. I mean, the writer Chabon has some interesting ideas about that, which we'll go on to talk about. And I've got a quote from him where he talks about how he would like to develop the story further beyond this short film. But she does actually make a moral decision to let him go, whereas Calypso in the poem doesn't let Odysseus go. Even though Odysseus is suffering, she has to actually be told by Zeus through Hermes, the god of the messenger god. Zeus is the king of the gods, that she has to let Odysseus go. So she's forced to let Odysseus go, and she's quite bitter about it. And eventually she does let Odysseus go, and she gives him food, and she gives him the materials to make a raft, like Zora gives Craft the shuttlecraft. But Zora reaches that decision on her own. And Craft also appreciates that she's done that. So I feel like there's more tenderness between Craft and Zora. I feel like the two of them are better for having known each other. Whereas I don't really feel that about Odysseus and Calypso.
No, he is very, I mean, Odysseus and Calypso, he's very much her prisoner. I mean, Craft and Zora, I think it's not that he's her prisoner exactly. I mean, she has rescued him. She is looking after him. As he says, she's been very kind to him. You know, she keeps doing things to try and make him happy, which is why we get this story where he wants to do something to make her happy, which is why he teaches himself this dance routine, and he can be Fred Astaire and they can dance together in her favourite film and so on. But it's certainly a very different kind of relationship. But also, I suppose there is that echo in a way of, you know, yes, Calypso has to be told what to do by Zeus. I took it that the reason that Zora is there and that she can't leave and she can't do anything is pretty clearly that she's been given these orders, and yes, she knows that the crew are gone, that they're all dead, they've been dead for generations, no one is coming back, but at the same time she's kind of constrained by her programming because she is this artificial intelligence, because she is, you know, the computer or whatever. She can't not follow her orders. So she's kind of, as much as she's evolved to become more than that and to become much more, for want of a better word, human, and much more of a person, and to, you know, she cries a tear when he walks out on her. As much as she's developed in all those ways, she's still kind of constrained by this original order that she's been given that she can't not follow somehow. So there's an interesting sort of contrast there. Whereas, you know, with Calypso, it's that the order is to let him go. And as you say, she kind of resents it. But again, who's going to argue with Zeus? You know, it's kind of pretty much on a level with like the captain of the starship gives you an order and you kind of have to do what they say.
Do you feel like this is a good homage to the Odyssey?
Yeah. I think it's great. I mean, I love this episode. As I say, you know, you and I, we only get to see these things extremely pixelated, you know, very poor image quality, distorted sound quality, often flipped horizontally so that you can't read any of the text on the screen. Everything looks back to front. But even despite all of this, you know, I watched it. I thought it was fantastic short film. I think it really sort of sells the idea of these short treks as potentially little artworks in their own right. I mean, it's this, you know, it's this a proper story. It's a short story, but it's a proper story with a kind of shape to it, and a lot of thought has gone into it, and just so dense as well. I mean, the fact, you know, aside from the fact that we've got Funny Face and Betty Boop and the Odyssey and so on, we've also got all these kind of themes about humanity and machine intelligence and all these, you know, some of these are familiar concepts in science fiction, I suppose, but there's so much in it. You know, you might think, okay, I'm going to write a 15-minute Star Trek story, that could be quite sort of flimsy, but I think you can really see that this is, you know, a proper sort of heavyweight writer has come in and really gone to town on this, and there's just so much in there for your 15 minutes or whatever. I think it's fantastic.
How do you feel about how Funny Face was used in the film? Like, Funny Face as a musical. Like, why do you think the writer chose Funny Face over other Hollywood musicals?
I think it's quite sweet. I mean, I get what you're saying, and maybe we can come on to talk about the failings of Funny Face as a film and why it maybe doesn't quite hit the mark. I think it works perfectly here, though. It's quite it feels slightly random, but at the same time, that's in some ways that in itself is quite humanizing of Zora, that she's, you know, she's not gone for a real classic of a film as her favourite film. She's gone for, as many of us might, you know, if you ask someone what their favourite film is, it might be something you'd think, you know, really? You know, it's sort of idiosyncratic. And she obviously, for whatever reason, really connects with it. I think it works because it's very kind of, especially that scene that they use, which is from the very end of the film, it's very kind of schmaltzy, it's very kind of cheesy in a way, and it's such a contrast to the kind of cool sort of mechanical sci-fi trappings of Discovery, which is all kind of shiny and metallic and so on. The fact that it takes place in this kind of green field, it takes place outdoors, and it's got this really kind of old-fashioned sort of, it's very cheesy, very silly kind of Hollywood musical sensibility. I think it works really well, and it is a romantic scene, and they kind of get a lot out of it, I think. and this idea of replaying it, it's kind of, there's an incongruity which makes it interesting, but there's also a kind of sentiment there which is easy to latch onto. I mean, I hadn't seen Funny Face until after I saw Calypso, because as well as not knowing that it was going to be about the Odyssey, I didn't know it was going to be about Funny Face. So that was my first encounter. Well, actually, I had tried watching it years ago and I didn't get very far because, like you say, there are problems with that film maybe. So I hadn't seen the scene which is referenced in this. But, you know, going back and watching it, I don't know that it illuminated my understanding of this episode of Short Treks all that much, but I think that what they used quite effectively. I think, you know, visually, musically, it adds something to the episode. It sort of earns its place. And the episode is not taking it all that seriously. It's not saying Funny Face is a great work of art or whatever. It's saying it's a bit kind of silly. It's kind of questioning, you know, he assumes Fred Astaire is the one with the funny face. Quite rightly, I'd say, if you were going to say which of Audrey Hepburn and Fred Astaire is the one who's got a funny face, it's going to be him. But notionally in the film, this is one of the flaws probably with it. We're supposed to buy into the idea that Audrey Hepburn is the kind of unattractive, funny-faced character. So I think it kind of pokes fun at it, but at the same time, when you've got that final reveal at the very end where she's named the shuttle Funny Face and she says she's given him his name, that's who he is to her, i.e. he's the one that she's fallen in love with, sort of almost despite herself. I think it kind of, I don't know, it feels like it ties together. It's kind of a bit random, it's a bit silly, but it's quite sweet. It feels quite sweet and heartfelt. And I think it gives an unusual insight into a kind of artificial intelligence character, insofar as we might expect their humanity to be developed. If you think of someone like Data, or even the Doctor in Voyager, their kind of growing humanity is all about, you know, classical music and art and culture and, you know, opera and so on. It's about this kind of high culture, whereas Zora's kind of claim to humanity is more in the fact that of all these, she said there are 5,000 films or something in the database, and the one that she really loves is this pretty schmaltzy, silly, I mean, it's a very silly film. It is quite funny. There are good aspects of that film, I think. There are moments that work, and it's very random and very off the wall and very odd, really. And I think that kind of says something about her humanity as a kind of artificial intelligence character in a way that's what means something to her.
I do think there are some parallels between Zora and the heroine of Funny Face, because the character Jo, who's played by Audrey Hepburn, is very cerebral, which sadly, I really don't like these stereotypes in films. As a woman who's fairly educated and is interested in books, it does kind of piss me off that they're always seen as unattractive geeks. Not in recent filmmaking, but like especially in the films of the 50s. It's kind of amazing that this stunning, beautiful actress, Audrey Hepburn, is supposed to be this sort of dowdy intellectual character. But she is supposed to be very smart, very clever, very interested in knowledge, and she runs a bookstore and is a little bit like Zora in the sense that Zora has a whole library of facts and information that she's using to try and enrich Kraft's life, you know, like producing food and giving him information and all that kind of thing, and trying to entertain him. So in a way, there is a kind of a link there. There's also a weird reversal, which is that the Audrey Hepburn character is far, far younger than the Fred Astaire character in Funny Face. In fact, Fred Astaire was like 30 years her senior, and it's kind of obvious. Whereas in the episode, in Calypso, Zora is like, she must be what, like 1,000 years older than Kraft? So there is that kind of strange connection there, that this is a massive like age reversal between the four characters. Yeah, it's a strange choice. But on the other hand, though, it reminded me a lot of the film WALL-E, where, you know, there's that little robot that's left on planet Earth, which has been abandoned by human beings because it's very dirty and polluted. And WALL-E continually watches a little cassette tape of the musical Hello, Dolly.
Right.
And his favourite scene, which he rewinds and plays again and again, is a scene in which two characters romantically hold hands and sing together. And it's that sort of idea that some stories transcend time and space. You know, that there are these universal stories. I'm not saying that Funny Face is a universal story, but the concept of love and romance and intimacy and a connection between people is a universal idea, it's a universal story. And that's what appeals, I think, to Zora, just like that's what appeals to Wall-E. And in a way, that's how Kraft becomes involved with Zora, is through acting out that story. So there is this kind of idea that some stories are kind of universal. They sort of do transcend time. And even in the Odyssey, although Odysseus does sleep with Calypso and could just stay there being Calypso's sex slave forever, it's his love for his wife Penelope that means that he can't be happy. And there is, in the Odyssey and in Greek myth, Penelope and Odysseus are known, or Penelope especially, for their faithful marriage. I mean, I know Odysseus sleeps with people, but he gets home to Ithaca and he kills all the men that have tried to marry Penelope in his absence. I'm not saying that's a great thing to do.
But it's true, like, she has waited longer than, everyone else assumes that Odysseus is dead. They think they're not coming home. I mean, if you compare, for example, the closest previous analogue to Odysseus, probably in Star Trek, is Janeway in Voyager. The situation of Voyager is similar to Odysseus' situation. They're kind of lost at sea for this vast length of time. Everyone assumes they're dead. Janeway's fiance goes off and marries someone else, I think. He doesn't wait for her. He probably does assume that she's dead, as everyone probably assumes that the Voyager crew are dead. But you're right, Penelope is the ultimate kind of faithful. She's the sort of emblem of the faithful wife, in a way, who will never accept that her husband's not coming back and will kind of sort of wait till the end of time. But I think there is that kind of parallel as well. As I mentioned, Odysseus, we hear he's weeping, all day long for his lost love and so on. And she's back at home sort of weeping for him and so on, and feeling very sad. And I think what you get with Zora is this terrible sense of loneliness. I mean, she's been there for, whatever it is, 1,000 years, evolving herself, developing herself, but she's been all on her own. And that's why, this opportunity to connect with another person is so precious for her. And yet at the same time, ultimately, she has to give it up because she recognises that he has to go. He has his own wife and family that he has to go to. She can't keep him, in a sense, as much as she wants to and as much as it means to her. And you're right. She is the better person. She does the right thing, in a sense, by letting him go, by recognising that, it's another sign of her kind of evolution, to sort of personhood or whatever, that she's capable of, putting someone else's needs above her own, in a way, doing the right thing, even though it hurts her. And it clearly does hurt her emotionally to do that. And I think you do get a sort of, you don't get quite the same sense in the Odyssey about Calypso, I suppose. But I guess it's at least slightly ambiguous, I think. She's described at one point as being dangerous, I think. Is she just this kind of bewitching monster, in a sense? Or is she in more of a sort of sympathetic situation? She is all on her own on this island. She obviously really wants Odysseus' company. She doesn't want him to leave. She's quite jealous of the fact that he'd rather be with Penelope, and she can't understand, why would you want a human woman when you could have a nymph, a sort of goddess, basically? Why doesn't he choose her? Really, she wants him to want to stay with her, and he doesn't. And ultimately, again, she's never going to really get what she wants, in a sense. And I suppose there is a kind of an element of pathos there, as much as she's also sort of a captor and a kind of obstacle. I mean, Odysseus in his journeys, he faces many different obstacles. There's the Cyclops, there's the Circe, who's the other nymph who turns all his men into pigs and so on. These kind of encounters with terrifying creatures, monsters. The sirens, for example. I mean, she's not like the sirens. The sirens are going to lure men, again, these women who kind of lure men to their doom or whatever. But she is a bit more sympathetic than that, I think, in that you at least sense that maybe she's not doing the right thing, but that she has her own kind of emotional needs, and there's a reason that she wants him there, or she kind of needs him there. But what you see in the Star Trek story is, Zora kind of manages to put her own needs to one side and lets him go because that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, there are other characters in the Odyssey that do want to keep Odysseus with them. Like you mentioned Circe, but there's also the sort of foreign princess Nausicaa, Nausicaa is young, and she finds him on the beach, having washed ashore, I think, while she's there with her handmaids, I think, and she's young. And
Nausicaa, another attractive young woman, incidentally, not a Nausicaan. For anyone wondering.
Oh yes,
from Star Trek point of view.
Yeah, yeah. Nausicaa, like the female name, not like the creepy character that once stabbed Picard, I think.
I was a bit struck when I was taken by that. This woman turned up and she was called Nausicaa, and I was like, wow, okay.
Well, you never know. It's quite possible that they were influenced by that name. I mean, it's not impossible.
Who knows?
But yeah, I mean, she's supposed to be a beautiful, beautiful person, like a beautiful character, like, and sort of innocent and kind of naive. But yeah, you're right. So Odysseus has to go back to Penelope. That's what he's aiming for. And Penelope herself is very crafty, like you said. She's a good wife for Odysseus. She has this tapestry that she weaves, and she says when she finishes the tapestry, then she will give up on Odysseus and choose a new suitor. She's a new husband who will then become the king of Ithaca. I think it's supposed to think it's kind of a bit of a sort of tribal type society where maybe the strongest man is the one that becomes the leader. And each night she weaves the tapestry all day long, and then each night she unpicks it in the dark so that the tapestry is never finished. I kind of wonder how no one actually noticed after 10 years that this tapestry was, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe they aren't the cleverest of suitors. But moving on now a little bit to talk about the concept of an artificial intelligence becoming so self-aware, so intelligent, so emotionally intelligent, to actually become almost human. I personally felt that there were parallels to be made between Zora and HAL in 2001, and also between Zora and the operating system in this new film called Her. Have you seen that film? There's a film called Her with Joaquin Phoenix
and Scarlett Johansson.
Right? Yeah. And Scarlett Johansson plays the actual operating system, and they fall in love with each other. She's a artificial intelligence, like Alexa almost. Yeah. And he's a lonely man, and it's sort of the opposite of Zora and Kraft. He's the lonely one, and they become so close that they end up kind of falling in love with each other. So, did you find this concept intriguing or creepy?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, but I think it's interesting. You're right. There's definitely a kind of connection with Hal. I think she's got some of that kind of slightly cool, aloof quality of Hal, especially to begin with. And the way the very beginning of the episode is directed and everything as well, there's something slightly sinister about it, because we know she's not telling the whole truth. I think visually, because we get that sort of image of that little circle with the kind of sound waves going up and down or whatever, it did remind me very much of Hal and his kind of little red light. It also made me think, though, I mean, and I'm sure this is tied into Her and the story. I haven't seen that film, but from what I've heard about it, in the real world, we have, I have an Amazon Echo that has a female voice. We have all these kind of digital assistants now, which, also typically by default, they're kind of female voices that they speak with. You have to kind of choose if you want them to have a male voice instead. And I do wonder, what does it say that in all these stories, 2001 accepted, but that in something like Her, it has to be a human man falling in love with an artificial woman, and it's always that way round. And I wonder whether that's part of, and if you think of other story, even something like Blade Runner or something, you've kind of got this idea of the kind of real man falling in love with this sort of unknowable artificial woman. And there's always this kind of question. I don't know whether it's partly gendered, because there's this idea that men don't really understand women and they don't really trust them. Kraft doesn't really trust Zora to begin with, hence this running theme of, is she a liar? Is she a liar? Are their feelings real? Are they genuine people in the sense they're pretending to be, or are they just kind of a construct? And I think it's interesting that, when you look at this artificial intelligence, there's also this thing going on in the Short Treks episode, which is all about you mentioned your issues with the film Funny Face and this idea of Audrey Hepburn implausibly playing this kind of, frumpy bookkeeper or whatever it is, the kind of stereotype she's playing into. She's very earnest, she's very serious, she's very intellectual. And she's kind of contrasted with quite funny character of the kind of model that she's replacing, who's extremely kind like a real sort of airhead, I suppose, that's being asked to pretend to be intelligent and so on. They can't get the photos because she kind of can't. She just keeps pouting and kind of doing all these kind of gestures of sort of traditional femininity in a sense of that era. And of course, the other thing you get, this may be part of the reason that we get Betty Boop in the Calypso episode as well, because Betty Boop, if you think of Audrey Hepburn in Funny Face as one kind of model of femininity, Betty Boop is almost the other extreme. She's totally over-sexualized. I mean, she's a kind of ridiculous character in a different way because she's quite sort of potentially quite problematic character because she's kind of depicted in this very childlike way, but also very overtly sexualized. And all the male characters in all her cartoons spend the whole time sort of lusting over her and sort of drooling at the sight of her and so on. And it's interesting when you talked about the film Her. And again, I haven't seen it, so I can't say too much about it. But one thing I do know about it is that they replaced Scarlett Johansson was not the first actress to voice that part, I don't think. I can't think who it was they got to begin with, but it was someone who I think was a bit more cool, was a bit more aloof. And then they replaced them with Scarlett Johansson, who is more, you know, if you think of what you think of her, she's associated with this kind of quite sort of old fashioned sort of sexy version of kind of Hollywood femininity. And I suppose there is this sort of question there when if you're writing these versions of this story, which we see again and again, where sort of flawed flesh and blood human male falls in love with a female computer, what does the female computer sound like? Whose voice is it? What is that personality, and what are we reading through that voice about the kind of woman that we imagine them to be? What are we taking these kind of female artificial intelligences? It's like there's this sort of question: how do we pin that non-human being in terms of kind of our ideas about human sexuality and human gender and all these kinds of things? And as I say, typically is always the man falling in love with the computer. I don't think we ever see stories. I can't think of one off the top of my head where a sort of flesh and blood human woman falls in love with a male artificial intelligence. Because I think we're sort of intuitively, we think, oh, a woman wouldn't do that. They know better. Unless, of course, it's Captain Janeway who does exactly that, I suppose. So she maybe is the exception that proves the rule. But look how much angst she has over this idea of, I can't really fall in love with a hologram. I just can't do that. It's sort of wrong. She's got a real, there's a real barrier there that I think there isn't for someone like Kraft. For Kraft, the barrier is he being unfaithful to his wife? It's not, is it meaningless or pointless or in some sense wrong to fall in love with a computer?
I feel very much like the example of Janeway constructing this hologram and sort of falling in love with this hologram is portrayed as almost, or maybe it's me reading into it, but it's portrayed as almost a little bit sad, and I'm not saying that Joaquin Phoenix's character in Her isn't portrayed as a little bit sad. I think he is portrayed as a little bit sad, to be honest. I think he's supposed to have had this relationship with a real human which didn't work out, and that's why he's now resulting to having relationship with an artificial creature, artificial intelligence,
like a sex doll almost. It's that kind of, do you know what I mean? That's the kind of, I suppose, the sort of stereotype that's behind some of those stories, isn't it? Is like the fake girlfriend in a sense. The closest real world analogue is those kind of blow up dolls or whatever, which, some men do engage in quite elaborate pseudo relationships with. And again, I'd never seen an example of a woman doing that with a male sex doll.
Well, there is a film about a man having a relationship with a female sex doll to the point where he actually has it like as part of his life. It's not just for sexual purposes. It's actually like a whole proper relationship. He takes her grocery shopping and stuff, and it's called Lars and the Real Girl, and it stars Ryan Gosling, and it's actually quite a sad but also kind of humorous film. I think even then it's portrayed as something that's kind of sweet, and I think the film is portrayed as something that is interesting and intriguing. There's a sweetness to it. It's also, he's kind of sort of a little bit lonely and a little bit pathetic, but it is kind of seen as something that's sort of sweet. And in Calypso, the episode, it's portrayed as something that's sweet, whereas I think with Janeway it's portrayed as more of a angst type dilemma and something that's kind of sad, like, oh, this poor woman can't have a relationship with anyone in her crew, despite the fact that she's obviously got a male peer, cough cough, Chakotay, who could basically be probably a good life partner for her, but never mind. And she does kind of create like the sort of holographic version of kind of Chakotay, to be honest. So I think the thing that I have a real problem with this is that it's the idea that the artificial woman is designed for the man. So the artificial intelligence is molding themselves to fit that particular man. And in a way, it is kind of almost like a nymph or a witch or some sort of magical temptress molding themselves, disguising themselves so that they appear to be everything that that man wants or that man thinks he wants. It's not really about falling in love with a real woman who is kind of a person in her own right.
And of course, what we get with Janeway is she starts. It's actually the opposite. It's not that the hologram is like molding himself to be what she might desire. She starts reprogramming him. Hence the famous, delete the wife, because she's actually actively going in there and saying, okay, well, if this is going to be my boyfriend, I want him a bit taller. I want him interested. I think she wants him to be interested in more into literature and so on. Like she kind of reprograms. As many people, I suppose, do when they meet a new partner and they think, well, I quite like this person, but there are a few things I'd improve. They try and kind of change them. They try and kind of nudge them in a certain direction. But it's interesting. It's very much, it's not like the witch kind of creating this illusory persona to seduce someone. It's the opposite. It's the person. It is more the person with the sex doll, I suppose, choosing, okay, I want this kind of hair color, and I want this kind of outfit. And I'm going to kind of, do them up to look more like this sort of person or not. But I suppose it's interesting in the case of Calypso, what we get is this, when he goes to all this effort to learn this dance and replicate this outfit and so on so that he can dance with Zora. And she says, but I'm not, I'm not real. I don't have a face, which of course is sort of relevant because this idea of the funny, there's this thing, who's the funny face? Is Fred Astaire the funny face? Is Audrey Hepburn the funny face? And so on. And the face is kind of the key to their humanity in a sense. This idea of what you see on Audrey Hepburn's face, which is not really that she's got a funny face, it's that she's a bit quirky and she's a bit, she's got a lot of character, I suppose, and that comes across in her face. Whereas Zora is kind of literally faceless. But then when she's asked to, she does produce this body and this face and this kind of sort of illusion of a kind of real human identity. And we don't really know where she got that image from. Has she kind of created it? Is it from, was that a person whose identity she's sort of used or stolen? We sort of imagine, from her archive or whatever, we sort of imagine she's kind of created it on the spot. But there's also this kind of interesting element there as well, that, this being Discovery, and obviously in the sort of Discovery world, Starfleet is big into holograms in a way that we weren't that familiar with in previous Trek. So it's not just that they're not in the holodeck and they're not kind of doing things, they're not watching films on a screen like we've seen previously. Everything is projected in 3 dimensions. So it's this kind of 3-dimensional thing. And there's also this element that they're going to dance together. They're going to embrace, they're going to, hold each other. And there's that kind of physicality to it. But at the same time, because of the projector and the way that it's projected, there's also a slight kind of unreality to it, if you know what I mean. It's not like the holodeck in Next Gen or Voyager or whatever, where it is basically a plausible recreation of reality in a sense. Like you could feel you're in a real place. If you woke up there, you wouldn't know that you hadn't been down to a planet or whatever. It's very much, it's kind of artificial and it's not real. And it reminded me actually, funnily enough, of in the Odyssey, there's the section of the Odyssey where Odysseus goes down to the underworld and he meets his mother, and he longs to throw his arms around his mother and to embrace her and to have this kind of human connection, and he can't do it, and she has to explain to him, and it's this quite kind of sad moment in a way where she sort of explains to him that the spirits of the dead can't be sort of touched in that way, that there is, there's no life there to kind of feel as a human being, that they're hollow, in that they are basically almost like holograms. They're these shades, they call them. Again, the idea of a shade is a sort of association with light, in the same way as a hologram is almost the opposite, is, this sort of creature of light. And obviously with Craft, we do see he's able to hold her, the hologram has kind of substance, like in the holodeck in Next Gen or whatever, they're able to dance together. But at the same time, when he decides he can't go through with it, he has these kind of flashbacks of his wife, he has this moment of guilt, he walks right through her, and suddenly she's, you know, just light, just a pattern of light, just projected light again. She has no real physical substance again. He can walk right through her, and that's the point where she sheds a tear, because I suppose in that moment it's kind of emphasized he's the real flesh and blood human being. She is just the illusion. She's not a real person, in quote marks. And I suppose that's part of the sort of pathos of that story, is not just that he's already married and that, you know, he can't stay with her because he's got a wife and a son to go home to, but also that on some level, as she says, you know, it doesn't count. I'm not real. I'm not the same. She's not going to be able to replace his kind of flesh and blood wife.
There is a scene in one of the most recent Blade Runner films. Mm-hmm. I can't remember what it's called, Blade Runner 2046 or something. And I'm sure that many people on the Babel conference will let me know.
I think it's 2049. I might be wrong. I haven't seen Blade Runner is my absolute favourite film, and I couldn't bring myself to go and see that film, even though I hear it's very good, and I will get around to it at some point. But I think you might be 3 years out, but, you know, I could be wrong.
You see, I actually hated Blade Runner. And,
oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I really dislike it. It took me about 4 or 5 times to get through it. And I don't know anything much of the new one either.
For us then. Okay.
Right. But, you know, that's the thing. That's why we do the podcast, because you know, everyone has different views. It's good good to find out about them. But yeah, in the most recent film, there is the main character is in love with her hologram, who's basically his girlfriend, but she's a hologram, and he can't touch her and he can't have sex with her, and they already have the emotional connection, like they're already in love with each other, but they can't have the physical connection. And in a way, it's sort of showing how important a physical connection is with someone that you love. Like, we are human beings, and we are supposed to be physically close to each other. You can't just have this emotional relationship without there being like some sort of physical connection. And in the actual film, sorry, spoiler, he hires or no, maybe she does, actually, I can't remember now, but one of them hires a prostitute, and the hologram projects herself onto the prostitute, and that's how they have a physical relationship. And it is weird. It's uncomfortable, because the prostitute's purely being used as like a physical vessel for this artificial intelligence. Like, he's not interested in the prostitute. He doesn't want to sleep with the prostitute. He wants to be intimate with his artificial girlfriend, who's the hologram. It's bewildering, but actually it's not something that's inconceivable in a future, in a scientific future where we are developing artificial intelligence a lot more, and artificial intelligence is becoming a lot more advanced. So, I mean, I don't think we should all rush to have emotional relationships with our Amazon Alexas, but it's not impossible that there is a future like that where you would have some sort of operating system that would have a real personality and that you could connect to.
And there is that real question, I suppose, isn't there? There is that anxiety around it, which is, I mean, as much as, you know, I'm not a big fan of the Fairhaven episodes, but they do kind of get to the nub of this quite complicated question in one way, which is that the hesitation, you know, we have this idea of the Turing test. Can a computer fool you into thinking that it's a real person? And there's, you know, and Star Trek obviously brings up this issue again and again. We've got the Measure of a Man, we've got the episodes about the Doctor and Voyager and so on. You know, is Data a real person? Is the Doctor a human, you know, not a human being? Is the Doctor a person? I think I mentioned before on a previous episode, someone once asked Jerry Taylor and Brannon Braga the same question, is the Doctor a person? And Jerry Taylor said, yeah, of course he is. And Brannon Braga said, no, come on, don't be ridiculous. You know, so it was like, you know, even within the writing staff on Star Trek, on Voyager, there could be wildly diverging views on such a kind of fundamental thing. But so there's this sort of question, you know, is a machine, what is artificial intelligence? Is it genuinely the same as being a being? Is it a person with its own rights and so on? Or is it just an approximation that's sufficiently sophisticated that it kind of fools us? And what you get in Fairhaven is Janeway says that's the reason she can't commit emotionally to a hologram, because she says, I can't be sure whether he loves me back. And the Doctor says to her, but isn't that the risk we take in every relationship? And I suppose there's that idea, isn't there, that, you know, to fall in love is partly a kind of, there's a trust involved that your feelings are reciprocated, and that someone isn't just pretending that they feel the same way about you as you feel about them. But if you fall in love with a computer or a hologram or whatever, can you ever be sure that those feelings are real? If it says it feels something, do you believe it? But ultimately, that is the kind of conundrum of our interactions with other people, and our, basic kind of trust in others, in a sense, almost requires us to make that same leap. But somehow there's this kind of philosophical question. Well, do I believe that it's, is it a matter of belief? Is it a matter of kind of intuition? What is it that makes you believe it when a human says it, but when a computer says it, you kind of think, can that be true? Or am I just being fooled, in a sense? Is it just an illusion? Is it a bit like a bewitching process? Something that, like the sirens or whatever, something that's not really what it seems to be.
Yeah, I would say that's a very good question, and that's a good idea to explore. But I would say that it doesn't seem to be an issue for most of the men in the stories that you've talked about, in the examples that you've talked about. I'm not sure that I hear that many male characters saying, does she really love me? In almost any level of fiction. Maybe in something like Wuthering Heights, maybe Heathcliff asks or questions whether or not Kathy loves him. I think he's pretty sure that she does, though, or he's going to force her to admit it somehow. But there aren't very many male characters, especially in romance stories, that ask, does a woman love me? That's kind of a very female trope, I think. Especially in these cases where it's an artificial intelligence that's been created to serve a human being or have an emotional connection with a human being, or in the case where a male character creates a female love interest. I'm thinking about Pygmalion and Galatea, that's a woman to suit him, his perfect woman. I think these male characters are just accepting it's a given that this woman is going, or this female character, this female personality is going to love them. It seems interesting that that's the kind of thing that Janeway would ask. That seems like a very female thing to do. Like, how do I know if this hologram will ever really love me? I mean, she could almost be saying that about a real human man, or real human male.
And in fact, we see it with a not human, but a humanoid character in the episode Counterpoint, of course, which is all about that kind of, will she give her heart, in a sense, to this man who she's obviously attracted to? Does he really love her? Or, at least, are his feelings for her sincere, whatever they are? Or is he just playing her? And are they both playing each other? And there's that kind of element of exactly that kind of trust. And ultimately in that episode, she is, she's not faking it. She is kind of falling in love with this guy, but at the same time, she is shrewd enough to protect not only herself, but also her crew and everyone, to not allow herself to be sort of deceived by him, in a sense, to keep her guard up. And I love that episode. I mean, we've talked about it before in a sort of different context, but I think it's very interesting the way that she's able to kind of emotionally commit to a certain extent, but without really making herself vulnerable, while kind of protecting herself and her crew and so on. And the way she handles that is quite impressive in a way. But you're right, there is that kind of anxiety around the female character. Is it genuine? Whereas Odysseus, I don't think Odysseus is ever going to question. I mean, wherever Odysseus goes, women seem to fall in love with him. That seems to just, and not just women, goddesses, any female entity that he encounters.
He's so crafty.
He's the Captain Kirk of
He's so funny.
of the ancient world, isn't he? Women just throw themselves at his feet. So, why would he ever question it? It sort of seems it would almost it seems sort of totally unnecessary in a way. And I think with Zora and Kraft, it's more, I don't think we do ever question it, because it seems, I don't know, as much as she hasn't been quite honest with him to begin with, and as much as there is maybe this sense of, is she keeping him there and she's trying to make him happy, and kind of, he said to her, look, you've got this shuttle, why don't you give him the shuttle, and so on. So there is sort of the option of her letting him go, and she's kind of choosing not to. At the same time, I think we, in terms of her connection to him, there's no question that it's genuine. We see her shed that tear. We it's kind of her, the story of Calypso, the episode, is really her emotional journey more than his in some ways. I mean, it's not the case that he's the protagonist and she's this kind of antagonist or whatever. It's much more, it's sort of about the two of them, but I feel in some ways it's more about her than it is about him almost. And of course, arguably, since it's a Discovery short trek, she is Discovery. Discovery is the main character in that episode, not Craft, arguably.
So, moving on now to talk a little bit about the future. Do we feel that there's a future for Craft or Zora? Like, is there more stories that could be told about them? The actual writer of this episode, Chabon. Is Chabon? Chabon?
Chabon, I think.
Chabon. Sorry, Chabon. He's quoted as saying, "I would love it," he said. "I tell you, I would love to tell the whole Odyssey. I would like to just take Craft and just retell the story of Odysseus' wanderings and the war he fought in and everything that befell Odysseus and try to find how he would do that in a very Trek kind of context." He also says, "What if someday Zora goes on to decide to abandon her orders, to go forth into the universe on her own as a ship?" He says, "I could imagine someday if she sort of spreads her gospel of ships being people, then you could have an entire race of sentient starships who have their own culture and their own rights." And he said,
wow.
"I don't know, this is just me
spitballing. This is like proper Ian M. Banks territory there, I think."
So what do you think?
Starship.
Do you think there's a future?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. He says he'd like to tell the story of the Odyssey because, of course, the story of the Odyssey, the story of the Odyssey, the kind of interlude with Calypso is almost towards the end. I mean, it's after Odysseus has lost his entire crew. It's after everything kind of, most of the things that are going to happen to him have happened to him. Most of the adventures have already happened. So in a sense, what he's saying is if he wants to talk about the war that Craft is fighting and how he's got to that point, that's almost like a prequel rather than a continuation, in a sense, of the story. And there's also this kind of fascinating issue about, what is the war that he's fighting? I mean, this is the furthest forward in Star Trek that we've ever been, I think, this kind of 1,000 years into the future. And it's a kind of tiny glimpse. And obviously there are these kind of huge continuity questions about, is this the future of the Star Trek universe and what does it mean? And there's also this kind of hint, which I think Michael Chabon has confirmed that this was his intention, that, Craft is fighting a war against the Federation, the Vidraish, which is this kind of corruption of the Federation. That's what they've become known as, who are the ones who've hoarded all this kind of Earth culture, who are the ones who, whose escape pod he's stolen. We're seeing things from the perspective of a guy who's actually fighting them. They're his enemies. And, what is this situation? Why are there humans fighting the Federation in the future? And people that we can be sympathetic to and so on. Why has the Federation become unknowable to the extent that its very name has been corrupted into kind of nonsense? Vidraish sounds like this kind of sinister alien species of kind of monsters or something. And yet this is the Federation that we believe is the kind of represents all that's good and noble and forward thinking about the Star Trek universe and so on. So there's this kind of quite dark sort of element there in the story somehow. And I don't know, I sort of feel like it works well as a short story. I mean, I kind of felt like when they announced they were doing these short treks, they were doing these short stories, I thought it was quite an interesting decision for Star Trek because it is quite a new direction. I like the fact that it's not like they're mini episodes. Some series, I think Battlestar Galactica, for example, used to drop mini webisodes in between seasons, and they would tell us sort of slightly ropey, fractured story in between these like 5 or 10 minute segments or whatever. Or maybe they were like 2 minute segments. I can't remember. But, in this case, they are choosing to craft, for want of a better word, these perfect little stories. And I think this is a fantastic short story. And I suppose a short story is different from a novel. A short film is different from a film. It is a very different kind of format. And I think it's nice that they're using this opportunity to tell these stories. And also, people have been saying for years, Star Trek should do an anthology show. We want a show where each season is a different ship and a different story. We want to keep jumping around. We want it to be in this time frame, this time, and in this time frame, the next. Well, they're almost allowing themselves to do an anthology show with these short treks by telling these very self-contained little sort of pieces. I mean, there's a big question, I suppose, in terms of the continuity. They've set up a pretty big piece of information that, Discovery's not going to get blown up by whatever crisis appears to be affecting the ship at any time. It's not going to crash. We know it's going to survive 1,000 years into the future, presumably. We don't know how it's going to get there. We don't know whether that's something we're going to see. Are we going to see on screen at some point the crew abandoning the ship and that this has been a sort of tease to set something up? Or is this just so far in the future and so kind of detached that it can exist outside of the we don't really need to ever find out how this story came into being. It can kind of be its own little perfect thing. Part of me sort of feels like the more they try to tie into it, the more they try to sort of bring this into the scope of the main story of the show, that they might start taking away from it somehow. I quite like the fact that it's this kind of self-contained short form. I don't know about you. I mean, we've seen 3 of these short treks now. What do you think about them, as a kind of form in themselves? Because obviously they've done quite different things with the 3 of them, but they are a new departure for Star Trek, really, this idea of doing these short stories. Interestingly, coming fairly hot on the heels of the whole issue about the fan films, and this idea the fan films are only allowed to be whatever it is, 15 minutes. And it's almost like they're kind of proving with these films, look, you can do something really good in 15 minutes. Don't get complaining to us about Axanar. Don't keep telling us you need 45 minutes or an hour and a half or whatever. Take your 15 minutes and do something like this if you think you can. There's sort of almost throwing down the gauntlet and saying, look, we can really make this format work for us in an interesting, kind of creatively interesting way.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's great that they're doing the short tracks. I think short Star Trek films are a great way to explore lots of different ideas. I think the first one obviously had like an environmental message. The second one, is linked to past culture, to the nature of stories surviving the culture in which they originated in and the society in which they originated in. There's something kind of epic about the second one. No pun intended. And I love the third one because it shines light onto a character who was new for the Star Trek universe with Discovery, and also is rather mysterious. We don't know much about Saru's people, about the Kelpians, and so it was nice to see a little bit of footage of his home planet and all that kind of thing. But I agree with you. I don't think they should use these short films to explain backstory or to link canon or to fill in gaps, because there's something wonderful about not having everything explained. And part of that is because you want the fans and the audience to be able to use their own imagination when watching the show. Because if they're using their imagination when they're engaged with Star Trek, then they're part of the storytelling. They're part of the franchise. They're involved. It's a much more reciprocal relationship with the shows, with the fiction, with the stories, than if they're just passively watching and everything's explained for them. And also you want people coming back for more, and people come back for more when there's gaps in the storytelling. And I wouldn't call this gaps necessarily. It's just that you're not showing everything. It's not like the writers have deliberately, accidentally left something out, or they haven't deliberately, they've accidentally left something out. It's more that you don't know everything about all characters, or you don't know everything about all history. And I think perhaps maybe certain parts of the fandom really enjoy having all the canon and all the sort of timeline of events and the Star Trek universe explained for them, or they like figuring it out themselves. But also, there is something wonderful about like the unknown parts of the franchise. I mean, that's kind of what Star Trek's about, is to go out and seek unknown, worlds and make new discoveries and meet new aliens. And I sort of feel like the fans are doing that when they're exploring the whole universe of Star Trek themselves with the stories. So to have everything laid out for you on screen is a bit. I just don't think it's very clever writing.
And I suppose the danger is, I mean, I liked the Saru backstory episode, The Brightest Star, I thought that worked well because it worked well as a sort of self-contained story in its own right. And yes, it is sort of, it could have been a flashback in another episode, almost like divided up into chunks is probably how Star Trek would have done it in the past. And in a sense, that does kind of fill a gap. It does fill us in on something that's been hovering over season one, you know.
Yeah, but they don't explain everything,
planet.
though.
But you're right. You're right. They don't really explain everything. There's a lot of mystery in that in itself. But I suppose I would feel concerned if the short treks were just being used to kind of plug gaps in continuity or to kind of provide helpful backstory so that we can understand the real story in the show. I think it's good that they're doing something other than that. And I think what they managed to do, you know, with these, we've seen 3 out of 4 of them. Who knows what Harry Mudd is not my favourite character. My expectations are not huge for the 4th one, but we'll see. Maybe I'll be surprised by it. But all 3 of these ones we've seen so far, you know, they've worked very well as a story, as a kind of piece of art in their own right, really. I mean, you know, they've made you laugh, they've made you cry, they managed to hit all the notes in that smaller form. So they're kind of resolutely refusing to say, okay, this is just a little morsel. You know, this is a small but a kind of perfectly crafted thing in its own right. And certainly I think with Calypso more so than any of them, there's this sense that, you know, this is a very intricate, detailed, sort of dense, rich piece of work that is being presented. It's not just something kind of tossed off to fill a gap, A, in the CBS All Access subscription schedule, and B, in the kind of production schedule and being done on the cheap. I mean, in a sense, they are a bit like sort of bottle episodes or whatever. You know, you have these stories that feature 1 or 2 actors, that feature existing standing sets. I know that's not true with the Saru one necessarily, but, you know, certainly the first 2 of the short treks, they're like, you can see they're consciously cheap to produce as well as being short. But at the same time, as with a lot of Star Trek's bottle shows, I guess those kind of practical constraints may lead to quite creative, you know, brilliant work. And I think so far they've all been fantastic. I've really enjoyed them. I mean, I hope we start seeing more of them. And also particularly this one, I do think that there's something, you know, maybe you can tell that this kind of heavyweight Pulitzer-Prize-winning writer has kind of brought his talents to bear on it, because there's a lot in there. There's a lot of kind of work gone into that script, and it kind of, you know, in 15 minutes, it feels like an episode that has a lot to say for itself.
Yeah, and it's been a while since they've used such a renowned writer, hasn't there? Because, I mean, I'm not saying obviously the writers of all the Star Trek series aren't accomplished, and of course they all are, and it's great also to have less well-known writers also working on the show, especially to give the chance to have more diverse voices being heard. But when was the last time they used a Pulitzer-Prize winner?
Well, exactly.
To write? It must be like the original series or something,
yeah,
right? So
exactly, yeah. I mean, I suppose we had it with the original series. We had these kind of sci-fi heavyweights, you know, people like Harlan Ellison, for example, you know, being brought in and asked to contribute. But I think you're right. You know, from Next Gen onwards, it was very much, yeah, you might have a sort of experienced showrunner who, you know, had done a fair bit of TV before, but actually a lot of the writers, they were bringing in these kind of really young, fresh new writers with not much experience, you know, people like, I don't know, Brannon Braga, or you know, these kind of young guys, and then they kind of worked their way up and they ended up in these sort of positions of responsibility. But Star Trek was really their kind of apprenticeship almost. And I think there was that sense of like, yeah, we'll pull in the writer that, you know, they're these young guys, they're good, they're full of ideas, they work hard. That was the kind of model, partly I suppose for bashing out this quantity of material that was necessary for those shows in the 90s. You know, you needed a lot of people, you needed people who could work fast, who had that kind of energy and so on. There wasn't generally that sense like you had with the original series of, you know, can we entice this kind of this great genius to come and work on Star Trek this week and kind of contribute something. And I think it's really interesting that with Michael Chabon, you know, they've managed to do that. And of course we know he's working on the Picard series, and for me that's a real as much as, you know, a lot of people say Kirsten Beyer working on the Picard series is a really good sign, the fact that the person who wrote this episode, Calypso, is working on the Picard series is definitely a good sign, I think, because, you know, this is the opposite of the kind of, occasionally with Star Trek we've had slightly lazy episodes, slightly lazy writing. Some of the faults that we maybe find with the writers of Star Trek in the past have been along those lines. This is absolutely someone who, you don't get the impression he's going to phone his episodes in. Do you know what I mean? You get the impression he's going to be really thinking about them, and there's going to be something kind of meaty there. And, ultimately, that's what we want. We don't just want disposable weekly entertainment. We do want stories that we can talk about, 10, 20, 50 years later, stories that we can, do a podcast about. I mean, we haven't covered a lot about discovery typically on Primitive Culture, but this was an episode where it just sort of screamed out for us to tackle it, because there's so much going on there, not just the Odyssey, but also, as you said, Funny Face, and also, and Betty Boop. I mean, we haven't got a huge amount to say about Betty Boop. Maybe, our listeners will chime in with their theories on how exactly Betty Boop relates to this story. But I mean, there is this one interesting question, I think, when I looked up Betty Boop, and particularly the specific Betty Boop cartoon that is played in the episode Calypso. It's the Betty Boop Snow White, which you can watch online. It's about 7 or 8 minutes. It's very short. It is a very creative. I mean, I find those cartoons weird. I feel like they were on TV when I was a kid. I was sort of vaguely familiar with her as a cartoon character growing up, though I hadn't really thought about her for many years. But they're quite surreal. They're quite artistically inventive. There's a lot of kind of transformation. I mean, you were talking about Circe, who, transforms Odysseus's men into pigs. All the human characters are constantly transforming into animals, into other things. They're very, compared even, say, to Disney or something like that, they're very kind of visually madcap, kind of surreal, kind of weird cartoons. And the Snow White one, the thing that interested me about this was that I read, I think in the 90s, it was one of these films that was selected for preservation by the Library of Congress. And you get this with various kind of art forms that, certain works of art are considered to be culturally significant and they're going to be preserved. And I don't know in practice what that means. The film stock is kind of kept in some vault somewhere, or, it's protected from degradation or whatever. I don't really know what that means in the kind of digital era when everything's been scanned and kind of duplicated a million times anyway. But it kind of made me think about this question. Zora says she's got 5,000 films in her kind of archive. Kraft said there were 800 films on his shuttlecraft that he could watch, but he ended up watching Betty Boop over and over again because he couldn't work out how to change the channel effectively. There is this sort of question, especially since there's this idea of, the kind of corrupted federation of the future, the Vidreish, and these are their kind of cultural artifacts. These are the things from the long ago, as they're described as. What is it that gets passed down? Why is it that we have the Odyssey passed down and not other texts? From the classical period, there's a lot of literature that it is lost, right? I mean, we get kind of a fraction of what there was has survived. And I suppose we've got this sense, going into the future, 1,000 years, I mean, more for, whatever it is, 1,300 or something years into the future, how much of our culture has survived and made it through? And I guess Star Trek typically, if you think about like movie night on Enterprise or the kind of stuff we see on Voyager with all this kind of schlocky entertainment and so on, it sort of feels like all of Earth culture is kind of there and available for anyone who's interested to go digging around and pull out some old, films or whatever and kind of get themselves immersed in it. In this story, because it's so far in the future, it sort of feels more, there's this sense of these slightly random relics that are almost, they're so much from another time, they're kind of hard to understand. I mean, Kraft sort of struggles to understand Funny Face in some ways. Zora has to kind of explain it to him. There is that kind of sense of the disconnection between people living in that time period and this kind of ancient culture, and how much of it has survived and how do they kind of interpret it. And I think that is kind of interesting, this idea of, what are we consciously trying to preserve of our own culture? Why have we decided that the 1933 Betty Boop Snow White cartoon is something that we kind of want to go forward in time, to be protected in that sense, whereas 100 other films made that year we're not that bothered about. Who is it who's sort of making those decisions, and is that how culture survives, through these kind of conscious acts of protecting and preserving it?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's this idea that stories or cultural artifacts survive like the decline or the destruction of the society or culture that they originated in, whether that's through some sort of intentional means or whether it's just accidental. And sometimes these things have survived because it's been so long. Like, ancient Greece didn't really fall apart in some awful, massive destructive. Well, there was lots of wars, but it didn't, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't like there was some horrific natural disaster or something, and that's why we only have the Odyssey and the Iliad out of all the epic poems that I'm sure were written. It's more that it's so long ago. Like, what actually survived ancient Greece, is minimal because it was just such a long time ago. But also, there were other things that did happen. Like, there was a massive fire in Alexandria many years later at the sort of rise of Christianity. The fire destroyed the library, and the library contained lots and lots of ancient Greek plays, like from Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, and a lot of the sort of literary classical heritage. So there are events that happen that destroy stuff, but there's also.
So we better hope that the Library of Congress have got some kind of backup system in case, the same thing happens again. Otherwise, Kraft might not be watching Betty Boop 1,000 odd years in the future.
Or he may be watching something else. But part of it is that it's the passage of time. Some of the stuff becomes very confusing for us because we're only seeing a small snapshot of that culture. Like, Betty Boop is a small snapshot of, like, that time period, of the visual culture that people were watching during that time period. Funny Face is one of, hundreds of musicals that were probably produced in the 50s. Yeah. So part of it is that we're only watching a small part of that culture. It's like you're looking through a tiny little window on a giant, and you're only seeing part of a giant picture, because you're only getting a glimpse of it. But also, there is something universal in stories that are preserved. So there is something universal in the epic poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey. There are universal themes. And I would argue that, I can't believe I'm saying this because I actually think Funny Face is a pretty bad musical, but there is something universal about that scene, at least, in Funny Face. So I do wonder if sometimes stories do survive, sometimes by accident, sometimes because they're deliberately preserved by people and they're deliberately curated, but sometimes because they just appeal to generation after generation of human beings who say, yeah, I felt that emotion that is described in that story, or I love the heroic themes of this poem, or I love that part of that movie because that's how I feel, or do you know what I mean? Like, I wonder if sometimes there's universal themes that we can all identify with, or that we can all tap into, and I wonder if those stories get preserved more than anything else because they appeal to just one generation after another.
And Odysseus is a very human character, I'd say. As much as he is this kind of cunning, he is very much like a Starfleet captain in a way. He's very smart. He thinks on his feet. He's kind of always one step ahead of the game. He's kind of good at kind of plotting his way out of a seemingly an apparent no-win scenario, basically. Like with the Cyclops, for example, he and his men are captured by the Cyclops. He has to devise a plan, quite an elaborate plan, which again turns on this kind of idea of concealing his name. He says that his name is nobody. So he has to sort of come up with a scheme to kind of brave his way out of it. But at the same time, he's not, even compared to, say, I suppose a lot of the characters in the Iliad, you've got a lot of these characters like Achilles or Ajax or so on, who are these kind of almost slightly kind of superhuman humans. Odysseus is the more relatable human, I think. Do you know what I mean? Like, he feels more like a kind of, aside from the fact that all these women are throwing themselves at his feet and so on, and he's brilliantly smart and cunning and all this stuff, but he has quite sort of normal reactions to things. He misses his wife. He feels the losses in quite a kind of normal way. He's got great ingenuity, but at the same time, he's got a kind of vulnerability as well. He sort of feels like, he feels like a more modern character somehow. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
He is. Like, anyone who's listening to this podcast and is interested in Greek heroes and the idea of ancient Greek heroes should go and listen to one of the first Primitive Culture podcasts that we did together, where we talked about the nature of the heroic epic and Star Trek. Odysseus is actually a more modern man. So there's a definite difference between the heroes of the Iliad, which is the poem that was composed before the Odyssey, earlier, and we don't really know when these were composed. So it could have been composed as many as tens, decades, of years before the Odyssey. And then obviously the hero, Odysseus, the men of the Odyssey, there's a definite difference between what they are showing as being exemplary, heroic ideals. So in the Iliad, it's Achilles and Agamemnon, you know, these strong brute force kind of heroes who are great fighters, who want heroic death. I mean, their aim is to die heroically in battle and to live a life where they're sung by bards and poets, you know, where they're basically their story lives on in infamy for generations afterwards. And in the Odyssey, it's a very different situation. It's a much more communal story. Like Odysseus has to make his way back to Ithaca so he can run his kingdom, so he can protect his family. It's a much more communal idea. And actually, Odysseus meets Achilles in the afterlife, and you know he's supposed to have had this heroic death on the battlefield in Troy, and now he's this former shade of himself, in this ghost in the afterworld, and he sort of regrets the way that he died. You know, he's very negative. So it's this idea, rather than an individualistic type of heroism, we've got this more sort of intelligent, cerebral type of hero who's more communal, more social in a way. Do you know what I mean? And that actually fit in with like the Athenian city-state at the time, when people would have been reading, or many years later, where people would have been reading or talking about the Odyssey. The Athenian city-state, so ancient Athens basically, whose patron goddess was Athena, which is the patron goddess of Odysseus, it was very much about being a good citizen, about voting, about supporting your community, about using your mind, a bit being cerebral. And of course, they all went off and fought, you know, in the Peloponnesian War and the Persian War. But it was less about individualistic freedom. It was less about being heroic through brute force. So he is a very different hero, and it's not an accident. You're not like imagining that. It's definitely deliberately different. And in the Iliad, his craftiness and his wiliness and the way he fights, you know, he creeps up on the enemy at night on their camp and slaughters them in their sleep, you know, rather than fighting out in the open, like in a duel, like Achilles and Hector. It's seen as rather distasteful. Like Odysseus isn't quite as heroic in the Iliad as he is in the Odyssey.
Right.
So the nature of what made a hero changed in the time that the two poems were being composed.
Do you mean he's not as heroic in the Odyssey as he was in the
No,
Iliad?
he's not as heroic in the Iliad.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
No, he's not. He's not considered as heroic in the Iliad.
He's not seen as a hero in the... Yes, okay, I see what you mean. Sorry.
No, he's a hero. He's a hero, but he's not seen as heroic.
He's not the hero. That's the thing, yeah.
Yeah, he's not. But he's also not seen as heroic because of the nature of who he is as a person. The fact that he is a liar and he's a deceiver and he's crafty. He thinks more with his mind and less with his sword. And the hero of the Iliad is Achilles. I mean, Achilles is this terrible hero. His actions lead to the deaths of hundreds of Greek men, and he has pride. And the whole of the Iliad is about Achilles' pride, and the whole of the Odyssey is about Odysseus's craftiness, basically, about his intellect. He also has pride, and one of the reasons why he ends up shipwrecked is because he basically calls to the Cyclops, ha ha ha, I beat you, my name's Odysseus. And so then obviously the Cyclops knows to pray to Poseidon, his father, and blah 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 blah. Anyway, I won't go on about it too much, but the point is that the actual nature of the nature of an epic hero changed from the Iliad to the Odyssey. So you have two very different types of heroes.
Considering how many goddesses and so on are throwing themselves at his feet, Odysseus seems to make enemies of rather a lot of gods at the same time, doesn't he? He kind of goes around, really rubbing a lot of them up the wrong way, and it always seems to have people who've got it in for him. But I suppose there is this kind of question more broadly, whenever you're looking at these kind of relics of a different age, of a different culture, in a sense, these kind of, artworks or other kind of cultural relics, as much as they resonate and they survive because they speak to these these kind of universal human truths, whether that's about love or whatever it is that speaks to people many centuries, sometimes millennia down the line. They do also encode these kind of elements of their own time, to the extent they can feel kind of dated. Their values and their outlook and their kind of expectations of what we admire in other people, what we expect about other people, can seem quite dated. So, even in the example of this story, which is very much about these kind of cultural touchstones being handed down. I mean, the episode is named after the Odyssey. The episode takes its kind of structure, its story in a sense, from an incident in the Odyssey, but it also gives us these two other sort of cultural reference points from within the 20th century and from within cinema, but both of them that sort of are sort of self-consciously quite dated in a sense, and that encode kind of ideas about their time. Particularly, I mean, you were talking about ideas about femininity in Funny Face and some of the elements of that film that maybe seem quite dated. But I mean, so Betty Boop is even more so. Is almost an alien artifact to us now because it seems so dated, and it's kind of the performance of sexuality in that is so much of its era. I mean, to the extent that Betty Boop apparently only, I think, a year or so after that film was made, a law was passed, a kind of censorship law in America that meant that the kind of sexuality of Betty Boop had to be toned down and changed quite dramatically. So it even became the kind of cultural norm, partly through censorship, changed, and is one reason that character seems very sort of surprising and so on. But it's very much, as you said, a kind of product of its time, as of course is all art, as is Star Trek. I mean, when we talk about the original series and the kind of production setting in the 1960s and the mini skirts and the kind of certain ideas that were around, and maybe there are occasionally moments where we think, that's a bit sexist or that's a bit whatever, but that was kind of its time. That was typically the time. And then you come to 90s Star Trek, and when we were growing up watching it, it felt very current and real and kind of contemporary and sort of accurate. Looking back on it, you can see some of these things. You have the benefit of hindsight, you have the benefit of a bit of detachment, and you can say, wow, that was a really, that was really of its time as well. I mean, early next gen, the music, things like that, they feel very dated to us going back to it now. That's not to say we can't enjoy it, but at the same time, we are more aware of that. And in time, I guess Discovery will as well. I mean, this is absolutely bang up to date, literally a month or two old, sort of 2018 Star Trek. It feels very modern, very classy, very kind of sophisticated and so on. We're not, there's no barrier in it that says this feels too trendy or too kind of the, of 2018 somehow about it. We kind of almost can't see it when we're living through it. But, in 20, 30, 50 years time, people looking back on that episode will be able to kind of have that different lens on it. They'll have that displacement, in a sense, that any cultural artifacts that survive, they do carry with them a part of the time that they were created in.
So the question is, will Star Trek survive 1,000 years?
Oh yeah, easy. It survived the first 50. That's the biggest hurdle to get over, I think.
Or will we be watching it in a different way? Like, will we be watching it in hologram form?
Definitely be watching it in holograms, yeah. Someone's, that's the next remastering job. I mean, once they've gone through DS9 and Voyager and managed to do those remasters, then, turning them into holograms, that'll be child's play.
Well, they can start on the holograms.
Or just skip the HD and go to. But you don't want fuzzy holograms. Fuzzy holograms are going to be, frustrating for everyone, aren't they?
So maybe
you need to get the
reality.
picture quality first. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe holodeck style, that kind of thing. Well, we've got that to look forward to. Lucky us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's been really interesting taking a look at Calypso, the Odyssey, Funny Face, Betty Boop, short films in the world of Star Trek. But this is not the only subject that has been discussed on the network this week, so here's a look at what you might have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, Literary Treks.
I just want to sing. After every time I hear the title of this book, I want to sing, "A time for war, a time for peace."
Funny story. When this was being pitched at the sales meeting at Simon & Schuster, somebody on the sales force was worried that they'd have to get permission to use the titles because it's a song by the Byrds, and John Ordover, the editor, had to gently point out that it was actually from the Bible and therefore kind of public.
Melodic Treks.
I suppose as being an actor, I just was really kind of feeling into Clive's character and trying to express the emotion of what I felt like he was going through on the Sarangi. So then it became much more of a personal, individual character. It was how I experienced doing it.
The 602 Club.
But I look at this film as being almost 3, maybe 4 different films, because when we're in Krypton, it's very sci-fi.
You mean excuse me, Krypton.
You mean
Krypton. We were on Krypton.
I'm sorry, Marla. Krypton. So when we're in Krypton, it's very much a science fiction movie. Next thing, all of a sudden, we have Kal-El come to Earth, and now it feels very Norman Rockwell. I mean, it's almost like, totally different from what we just saw on Krypton or Krypton.
To the journey!
Brace for impact.
Brace for impact, yes. Okay, if I'm going to make a commitment to myself right now. If I am ever perishing in a plane crash, I am going to say brace for impact right before I die. To everyone on the plane.
I will
brace
somehow
for impact.
hear it across the miles.
It'll be very dramatic, with some dramatic theme music playing, hopefully, just like we have in Voyager here this episode.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published.
And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation on the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up.
If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Primitive Culture is brought to you by Duncan Barrett and Clara Cook. You can find Duncan Barrett on Twitter at Barrett's Books. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC.
If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details.
Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our associate producers here at Primitive Culture, Tony Black and Amy Nelson. Tony was one of the founders of this show, and we still keep him in the loop about what we're doing. You can find him on Twitter at @AJBlackWriter and online hosting about a dozen other podcasts on everything from The X-Files to classic cinema. Amy is the host of 2 shows on the Trek FM network, Earl Grey and The Edge, and you can find her online on Twitter at @Miss Amy Nelson.
You're blended, all right.